Joining us now, Dr. Scott Gottlieb. He's the former FDA commissioner, a CNBC contributor. He sits on the boards of Pfizer and Illumina. Nice to see you as always, Dr. Gottlieb. Given everything you've learned and observed over the week today, what are your latest expectations when it comes to a second wave?
Well, look, we see a persistent level of infection around this country of about 20,000 diagnosed cases a day. And that's been persistent for about a month now. And it may be that we just can't get below these levels and we take a lot of infection into the fall. I agree with Tony, a second wave isn't inevitable this fall. But if we continue to have this level of infection heading into the fall, when we're going to reopen schools and reopen college campuses and try to go back to work in more earnest, that's a lot of infection seeding the country that sets up the conditions for a resurgence in the fall. And it's going to be harder to control. Because remember, these 20,000 infections aren't 20,000 infections. We're only diagnosing probably about 1 in 10 infections now. So this is really 200,000 infections. And this has been persistent. The question is, do you need to crush the epidemic, or can you have a level of spread and be able to contain the spread within that level? And a lot of countries like Japan, South Korea, Germany really crushed their epidemics. We haven't been able to do that here. Some states have done it, but a lot of states have had this sort of persistent spread all through the epidemic.
I know you're watching the rising cases, Dr. Gottlieb, but how then do you explain places like Georgia, which was among the first and most aggressive to reopening? We haven't seen a surge. The Lake of the Ozarks, crowds of hundreds of people, gathered very closely on Memorial Day weekend, and why there's no surge there. How do you explain these things?
Well, let's look at Georgia. So New York had the biggest epidemic in the world in terms of what happened in New York City. New York City implemented very tough measures. They really crushed their epidemic. If you look at the epidemic curve, it's come all the way down. New York City recorded a day, the first day, with no deaths in a very long time. New York State's recording about 150 hospitalizations a day right now. They've come all the way down their epidemic curve. Georgia, by contrast, has more hospitalizations than New York right now. They never really had a very large epidemic, but they never really extinguished it. New York City was heavily seeded from people immigrating largely from Europe. Georgia was never as heavily seeded. So they had infection coming into the state. They had a level of spread. They've brought it down to a lower level than what it was at, but they've never been able to really crush the epidemic and drive down their curve all the way to the kinds of levels that we're seeing in New York on sort of a comparable basis. And so if they take that level of infection all the way through the summer, I think they're setting up a lot of risk for the fall. And that's really what we're looking to right now. We may be able to sustain this through the summer because we have a backstop from the seasonal effect of the summer. We may not see a surge in infections, but we may not see it go down much either. And that's a lot of risk for the fall. And I don't know that we're properly discounting that risk for the fall right now.
Dr. Gottlieb, been a lot of talk this week about what the protests are likely to show us of the likelihood of a second wave. What will you be watching out for in the data, and when would you expect to have got confirmation of whether that caused a big second spread or not?
I think it's going to take a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, really, to see the impact from these gatherings, these large gatherings. And I think it's inevitable that there will be chains of transmission that got lit from these large gatherings. You look at the pictures, a lot of people are wearing masks, so they are conscious of the fact that there's still a pandemic going on. But notwithstanding that, these kinds of gatherings create risk. There'll be spread that emanates from these. On what scope, we don't know. It's hard to tell. I think we're going to really need to wait 2 or 3 weeks because it's likely to take 2 or 3 cycles of transmission before you start to see the impact of these kinds of gatherings show up in any official statistics. There'll be sort of one round of infections that gets sparked from these, and then you'll have to go through 2 or 3 rounds of infection really to see it show up. So you have to look at states like Minnesota, which already had high levels of infection to begin with, had high prevalence, and see if you see an uptick to really determine, as well as New York. I mean, New York was really coming down the curve aggressively. If you start to see an uptick in New York in the next 2 or 3 weeks, some of that's going to be from the reopening. Some of that could be from these gatherings. It's really going to be hard to isolate the effect.
Dr. Gottlieb, earlier in the week, we had a CNBC survey that suggested quite a surprisingly high percentage of people didn't want to take the vaccine if and when one was fully operational. Is that a problem? Do we need to see everyone get vaccinated for the vaccine to be fully effective?
No, we don't. And actually, the levels in that survey is pretty consistent with what we see about vaccine uptake. About 30% of people take the shingles vaccine who are eligible. About 45% to 50% who are eligible for the flu vaccine take the flu vaccine. If we can get to about 40% vaccination rates on the COVID vaccine, that's going to be sufficient. Because remember, by the time we get to a vaccine, even assuming we don't have an epidemic in the fall, we don't have that second wave, if we sort of continue on this slow burn of 20,000 infections a day and a doubling time for the epidemic of every 60 days, by the time we get to a licensed vaccine in probably early 2021, fully 25% of the population or 20% will have had COVID. If you can vaccinate an additional 40% on top of that, you get to herd immunity. So we're not vaccinating a population that isn't already exposed to COVID. By the time we get to a vaccine, a sizable portion of the population will have been exposed. And if we do have a true second wave in the fall and we have higher infection rates, an even higher percentage of people will have already been exposed. So I fear that we're going to have to get through sort of one more cycle with this infection before we get to that vaccine. We will get to a vaccine. We're going to have a technological solution here. That all the data shows us that from these early vaccine trials. But we're going to have to get through the fall and maybe part of the way into the winter until we can get to that point.
Dr. Gottlieb, thanks for joining us.